Um, I spent much of my life actually wrestling with the question of what's the relationship between urbanisation, capital accumulation, and various forms of social conflict, including, of course, class struggle and anti-capitalist struggle. And Rebel Cities, which is the latest essay on this theme, attempt to bring together some basic ideas, and it's of course particularly appropriate at this particular conjuncture because the present mess which we are in really was signalled by a collapse in housing markets, particularly in the United States, but in certain regions of the United States, particularly American Southwest, Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, also in Florida and Georgia. And it was paralleled, of course, by the collapse of housing markets elsewhere, most notably in Spain and Ireland. So clearly, this turn of the crisis had something to do with urbanisation, and therefore was very, I think, an appropriate moment to start to look more closely at the relationship between crises in general and urban processes in general. And it turns out, when you look historically, that there are many examples of exactly this same scenario being played out again and again and again, not necessarily only with housing, but also with commercial property or with physical infrastructural investment. If you would include in this, back in the 19th century, the crises that were associated with the building of the railroads, I think you would see a long historical pattern of relationships. And this pattern is not only about crisis formation through excessive investment in land, property, urban development and all the rest of it, but it also turns out that historically capitalism has got out of crises by actually engaging in a new bout of urbanisation in a very different kind of mode than existed in previous periods. This, to me, is actually signalled right now in the following way, that whereas much of our part of the world is mired in crisis, in part as a sort of outcome of this collapse of property binges and speculative activity in urban development, another part of the world is actually getting out of crisis by doing exactly the same thing. That is, if you look at a country like China, you would see a sudden dip in employment, a huge dip, in fact, in employment at the end of 2008, 2009, when there was a collapse of the export markets, and the estimates at the time was that China, during those months, lost something like 30 million jobs. By the end of 2009, however, the ILO and IMF issued a joint report on net job losses. And by the end of 2009, the estimate was that the net loss in China of jobs was only 3 million, which means that somehow or other the Chinese have created 27 million jobs in something like 9 months, which is an astonishing accomplishment. And what were they doing? Well, first off, there was this central government stimulus package, which was about infrastructural investment, building new railroads, highways, dams, and the like, even building whole new cities with actually no residents in them, which created a rather odd situation in that in the United States press there appeared a series of advertisements suggesting that anybody who needed a house and a decent living might want to migrate to one of these new cities in China that yet had not got anybody there. So that sort of investment. The second thing they did was to basically turn to the banks and say, lend to local development projects of all kinds, which they did at a furious rate. And of course, there's a real structural difference here, that if the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party says to the bankers, lend, they do. When Obama turned to the bankers in the United States and said lend, they told him to piss off. So the power structure is quite different. But what do they lend to? They lend a great deal into the property market, and the result was a huge increase in property prices. Property prices in Shanghai doubled in 1 year. Property prices nationwide over the years were increasing at 10, 15%, something of that kind. But this property boom absorbed vast amounts of capital and labour, and essentially got China out of a very serious mess. Now, of course, the Chinese are mortally afraid of social unrest, and therefore labour absorption is a priority as far as they're concerned. For some reason or other, the ruling classes in this part of the world are not afraid of massive unrest, and so labour absorption they don't care about it at all. They simply care about profit rates and saving the financial institutions, and that's it. So you have this peculiar situation in which urbanisation created crisis in one part of the world, which then spread to another part of the world, which is getting out of the crisis by an urbanisation project of quite astonishing proportions. And that history is actually there sequentially as well as geographically. And I've come across it many times in the researches. And the most obvious occasion for me was looking at what happened between 1848 and 1871 in Paris, between the Revolution and the Commune. One of the first major crises of capitalism in which unemployed capital and unemployed labour were sitting side by side was in 1847-48 throughout much of Europe. And the solution in Paris was first off a revolutionary movement in which workers took control in the sort of February, and then a kind of counter-bourgeois reaction in the summer days when they gunned down many of the revolutionaries and re-established a bourgeois order, didn't know quite what to do, and then Louis Bonaparte came to power. But Louis Bonaparte was smart enough to know that unless he got capital and labour fully employed, he wouldn't last very long, and so what they did was to manage a vast re-urbanisation project of Paris, brought Haussmann to Paris, and so now you can go and see what they did during the Second Empire as you walk down all of those boulevards. And this was a major re-engineering which absorbed vast amounts of capital and labour during the 1960s. But the important thing to recognise here, and this is also true in China, the important thing to recognise here is that urbanisation is not just simply about physical infrastructures, it's also about the transformation of lifestyle. And so what you'll see in Second Empire Paris is the coming of the new department stores, the boulevards becoming the kind of entertainment spaces and consumer spaces that they still are to this day. So actually full employment was assured by this transformation of lifestyle, by the coming of the new gas lighting, the development of the sewers and the water supply systems and all the rest of it, and the creation of a sort of what was known as the City of Light, which became an entertainment centre for all of Europe and fashion and all those kinds of things. Louis Bonaparte figured one interesting way in which he could get everybody back to work was to mandate that everybody should change their court dress, and the military should change its uniforms, which immediately meant that all the seamstresses in Paris were fully employed, sewing like crazy to try to catch up with the fact that everybody had to turn up to court in a completely different way. So the point about this is that this transformation of lifestyle, of course, had a class character to it, and what you see in the Second Empire is one part of the city starts to develop this consumer culture, radical consumerism, in society, the spectacle, and many other things of that sort, whereas much of the rest of the city, the sort of workers in the city, are increasingly being expelled from the central city by a process of rising rents to some degree, but also by the redevelopment, which classically sort of meant the demolition of much of the low-income housing and the demolition of older working class quarters, and the expulsion of much of the working class from the city. So by the end of the Second Empire, you get two cities. One is the central city, which is where the bourgeoisie is engaging in this crazy consumerism. Then beyond, outside, is the working classes that are living in increasingly impoverished conditions around the periphery. And towards the end of the empire, when the urban expansion comes to a sticky end, as usually happens, the speculation went too far, and there were financial crashes, and the financial crash then even meant a financial crash in municipal finance for the city of Paris, so it crashed too in 1868. Haussmann was forced out of power. The major financial institutions that had financed much of the transformation went bankrupt in 1867. Then there's a big question of what's going to happen in the city, and there's a lot of social unrest. And during that period, there occurred a dreaded kind of process for the bourgeoisie, which was known as the descent from Belleville, Belleville being one of the new sort of working class suburbs out on the centre, way out of the centre, where the working class had been forced to live, and they would come back into the centre of the city and demonstrate and go to the Bastille and kind of, have meetings and things of this kind. And this, of course, led into the Paris Commune after there as well. So that this urban process reconfigured class relations, reconfigured actually the geography of class relations, and in a sense the commune can be interpreted in part as is the working class returning to the centre of the city and reclaiming the right to the city that they had built. And that's where this notion of the right to the city, I think, starts to come into play, that they built it, they believed it belonged to them, and they wanted to reclaim their right, and this is what the Paris Commune, in some ways, was about. So this was, if you like, one spectacular instance that that made a big impact on me when I was looking at it, about what the relationship is between both the formation of class struggle, but also the formation of the conditions of class struggle. A similar situation arose in 1945 in the United States, when after the post-war period the question was, how was US productive capacity, which had grown immensely during World War II, going to be redeployed after World War II in ways that didn't get back into the depression conditions of the 1930s, and this was a very, very serious problem. And there were a whole set of reforms, a whole set of governmental moves and so on to make sure that this did not happen. And one of the big moves was, of course, the suburbanization of the United States. Now, what the suburbanization of the United States rested upon was, of course, the sucking in of a significant group within the working class, mainly the privileged white unionized working class, into home ownership, living in the suburbs. And again, it was a change of which had a political purpose as well as an economic purpose. A lot of the surplus capital, productive capacity was put to building the American suburbs. The suburbs were developing apace, but at the same time there was a pacification program of what the working class was about by their absorption into a system of consumerism that was based on home ownership in suburban environments, in which, they all ended up owning a car. They all had, many of the accoutrements that go with a suburban lifestyle, and of course they are very much enamored of capitalist consumerism, and so, hardly at that time made for a revolutionary class, because they were basically absorbed in a certain way into the capitalist system. But again, in exactly the same way that Paris showed a differentiation, so the suburbanization of the United States left the inner cities bereft of investment. Those are segments of the working class, particularly the minorities, chiefly African Americans and the like, were left isolated in the inner cities, and so in the 1960s you get the urban uprisings throughout the United States, and particularly culminating in a huge uprising in many, many cities in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, in which many parts of the US cities were central cities were burned down, and tremendous violence and repression was involved in cities like Detroit, Los Angeles, and the like. So again, there was a sort of reconfiguration of urbanization during the 1950s and 1960s in the United States, which absorbed a lot of capital and labor, but at the same time produced a scenario and a situation in which eventually there is a revolt of the inner cities. A revolt that was joined also to some degree by dissident elements within the suburban areas. Suburban living was very boring and very homogeneous. White youth began to revolt against it, and so we have the famous incident in 1968, I think it was, when students at Santa Barbara buried a Chevy in the sand, protesting against the banal consumerism that existed around them. Feminists of that period regarded the suburb as their chief enemy to their own liberation, and so there was a tremendous anti-suburbanite sentiment, which led eventually, of course, to the reoccupation of the central cities and the transformation of the central cities after 1970 or so. Before 1970, you would not find a sidewalk cafe in New York City. After 1970, sidewalk cafes came out all over the place as people tried to create an urban lifestyle of a different sort. That too, I think, is the kind of lifestyle that led into the collapse of 2008 with the urbanization project in the United States. Now, in all of this, there is this clear relationship for me between property development booms and macroeconomic crises, and you look back and you see the collapse of the Japanese boom in 1990, which was based on the collapse of the land market. You see that Sweden, the banks had to be nationalized in 1992 because of this. If you go back and look at 1973, you'll see a collapse of global property markets. So there's a clear relationship between the utilization of urbanization to get out of crises and get into crises. And there's a wonderful comment that when even the sort of the Federal Reserve woke up to this problem, wrote a report, the San Francisco branch, and kind of said, the US has always got out of recessions by building houses and filling them with things. And so the big issue for the United States right now is how do you build houses and fill with things when you've got a surplus of about 6 million houses out there which were foreclosed upon. And so this is why it's so difficult right now to actually see, for the US to see its way out of a crisis, even leaving aside the ideological attempt by the Republicans to prevent any kind of form of development that might actually help Obama get re-elected. So this leads, if you like, also into the question of how does class struggle come out with. I've already mentioned that to some degree the movement of '68 in the United States was an anti-suburban movement, that the Paris Commune was a movement of a certain sort, which is about reoccupying the city. And it looks to me, when I again go back, how much of class struggle has actually erupted in cities. So cities are sites of class struggle, but often the city is the subject of the class struggle. That is, the urban lifestyle becomes what is to be revolted against, and therefore the desire to create something rather different on the part of different groups in the population, making different claims to rights to the city, and if necessary, pursuing the idea of an urban revolution as being one of the ways in which they can exert their own concerns. And on this, however, what is interesting is to look at I think a little bit of a conflict which exists on the left, which tends to emphasize work-based organizing and the factory and all of the rest of it. And my own view all along is that you really cannot isolate what might be called neighborhood struggles or community struggles or urban-based struggles from those struggles which exist in the workplace, and that the unity between the two is absolutely crucial. And actually, if you look back, the most successful work-based struggles are always those where there's a good deal of neighborhood support and community support. This was true of even something like the Flint sit-down strike of 1937 in the United States, It's true right now in Argentina, for example, where the recuperated factories to some degree have managed to maintain that way because they've opened themselves up to become community centres, cultural centres, educational centres, and all the rest of it. So when the original owners turn up and say we want to reclaim the factory, we want to reclaim the machinery in the factory, the whole neighbourhood turns out and stops them. And it is that unity which I think is absolutely critical and has been critical, and I think has not been appreciated enough in terms of left organisational politics. For myself, I think there's a whole kind of question of how can we organise a whole city? How can we organise a political struggle throughout a whole city which covers many of the people who are producing and reproducing urban life? I have quite a few Marxist friends who are very morose in the United States because the working class has disappeared. And you kind of say, no, it's not, it's disappeared. The factories have disappeared, they've all gone to China, so if you want to go and be revolutionary on that sort, you better go to China. But here we have a whole working class which is actually producing urban life. And recall here that Marx's definition of all those people who transport things are actually producing value and surplus value. So all of those delivery trucks in New York City and all of the cab drivers and everybody, they're all producing value and surplus value, and therefore the organisation of that working class becomes absolutely critical. And so how can it be organised? Can it be organised sectorally, or is it better to organise it geographically? And so I think geographic forms of organisation become absolutely critical in relationship to what the dynamics and dialectics of class struggle are all about. Now, I'm not alone in thinking this. I mean, when I wrote Rebel Cities, I had either forgotten or not noticed that actually Gramsci had made this point back in 1919. So let me read you a little bit. He's talking about the factory councils. And there have been a lot of complaints, by the way, about the way the history of the factory councils has been written. It's been written as if it was just the factory councils. And as some people have pointed out, the parallel with the factory councils were these places called houses of the people, which were organisations in neighbourhoods and communities which were very much in support of what the factory councils were about. And of course, the people who were involved in the houses of the people have a very different structure. Actually, it turned out that that's where mostly women were tended to be involved, and so again there are certain gender biases in the way in which much of this history gets written. But Gramsci himself was advocating something rather different from just the sort of factory councils. He argued that factory councils should be paralleled by ward organisation, and that there should therefore be set up ward committees. And he wrote this about the ward committees. The ward committee should also seek to incorporate delegates from other categories of workers living in the ward: waiters, cab drivers, tramway men, railway men, road sweepers, private employees, clerks and others. Now this is a very interesting definition of who the working class is, which is rather different from that which is concentrated merely on factory labour. And then he continues, the ward committee should be an expression of the whole of the working class, living in the ward, an expression that is legitimate and authoritative, that can enforce spontaneously delegated discipline, that is backed by powers, and can order the immediate and complete cessation of all work in the ward. I would add also beyond, if necessary. Now, what we've seen over the last few years, for instance, in the United States, 2006, there was an immigrant rights workers movement, which actually, when it was threatened, organised on exactly this kind of ward basis. And the result was that on the days when it decided that it was not going to go to work, that Los Angeles closed down, San Francisco closed down, Chicago closed down, and in fact the city was stopped. It was in effect a strike of the whole city. So we've seen many instances where these events have an urban configuration. And I think this is very important to cultivate and therefore to militate. And furthermore, we're not talking here about single cities. What was interesting about 1848 is that it wasn't just Paris. It also was Frankfurt, it was Milan, it was Vienna, What was interesting about 1968, it wasn't just sort of Paris, it was also Chicago, it was also Bangkok, it was also Mexico City. And I thought one of the more remarkable events in our recent history was February 15th of 2003, when there were 3 million people on the streets of Rome, 2 million in Madrid, 2 million in Barcelona, 1.5 million or so in London, all protesting against the possibility of a war with Iraq. Now, okay, it was an epic phenomenon. It lasted for one day, but there's something about the urban network, which it seems to me has a lot of political possibility. And if I fantasize at all, and I would say, well, in exactly the same way that capitalism arose out of feudalism by networks of cities like the Hanseatic League, then maybe we could look towards the construction of a league of socialist cities as the cutting edge of some sort of future for socialist transformation. But that requires that we actually look upon the city and we look upon urban social movements as integral. And that list that Gramsci gave of the people who are organised, it corresponds rather neatly with an organisation that has arisen in the United States, which is about it's called the Excluded Workers' Congress. And the Excluded Workers' Congress is all those labourers in the city who cannot organise by normal kinds of unionised means. It includes, for example, the taxi drivers. It includes the domestic workers. It includes the restaurant workers. It includes immigrant rights workers, and it includes those people who the ex-prison population. And by bringing together all of those groups, you begin to talk about a labour force which is absolutely crucial for how the city works. If, for example, none of the domestic workers went to work, what on earth would the Wall Streeters do? They'd have to stay at home and change the nappies and things like that, and horror upon horror. And that population is living under increasingly dire circumstances. The recent information on income inequality in New York is the top 1% of the population in New York earns $3.57 million a year on average. Half of the population of New York City is trying to live on less than $30,000 a year. These are the people who no longer can live in Manhattan because Manhattan has become a vast gated community for the rich. They live way, way out, and a bit like in Paris, in the Second Empire, they're way out on the periphery and travel into the city every day at about 6 o'clock in the morning to wake the city up and get it going. There's a tremendously important labour force here that we should pay a great deal of attention to organising, and organising in conjunction with workplace organising. It's not a substitute for it, but it seems to me it's absolutely critical to try to put this together. And the urban is, if you like, the site where this can be best done, and the forms of organisation can best be articulated. And I think we have not paid enough attention to that particular kind of dimension of organising. And that is, if you like, one of the major themes that I tried to get to in this book, and then talk about how successful there are certain recent examples are of organising along these lines and what can be done. You'll see this in Latin America, most spectacularly recent years, of course, Cochabamba and El Alto. El Alto, the organisation of El Alto was such as to actually bring down 2 presidents and paved the way for Evo Morales to come to power. So that there is a revolutionary strength which exists in cities and urban social movements, which I think have to be integrated fully into the class struggle. And over the years, I'm afraid I've had many Marxists who tell me, oh, you're just interested in urban social movements, they're not real workers' movements, and you kind of go, oh, yes they are, and they're fundamental. And I think that this is one of the areas in which, particularly under the present circumstances after deindustrialization has destroyed so much of the conventional power of working class unions and the like, that this is the moment when we should really rethink who is the proletariat, how is the urban proletariat defined, and how can we organize around the whole of the working class, and in so doing, would we organize geographically? And would that geographic organisation actually stick? And actually, historically, even within the British movement, there are probably many people here I was always very impressed with the trades councils in many cities that in fact they do that, and sometimes they have a better sense of what the condition of the whole proletariat is in the city than do the unions, who frequently end up, sort of agitating for the benefits of their own members. So this is, if you like, the main argument I would want to make, and suggest that the time is ripe for a reorientation of some of our strategies of class struggle, so that the urban becomes much more central than it typically has been. So let me leave it there. Thank you.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the position of one of the minority groups in this post-industrial situation, disabled people around the world, who are now getting organised. For instance, in this country we've had quite a lot of activity as the hardest hit of the current round of cuts. The disabled people are self-organised. There's now been some solidarity. There are a couple of my colleagues from Disabled People Against the Cuts speaking later today. But it seems to me that disabled people, classically in Marx, are viewed as the reserve army that are only brought in when capitalism is booming. And yet we exist in the urban space. We exist as a proportion much more in the urban space than elsewhere. For instance, in South Wales, as the deindustrialisation took place, 25% of the population is disabled people. In most of the inner London boroughs, we're up at 25%. And this is a group that has to be involved in this, and clearly are part of the working class, but have always been seen as separate from the working class. My own work at the moment, through World of Inclusion, is looking at the education of disabled children, and we have this clash between declarations from the sort of liberal organisations, the United Nations and so on, saying education for all children should be educated, and there has been a big push on that from capitalism and the World Bank, with 50 million extra children now in developing countries in education. But the one group that's left out, right across the world, are disabled children. And so this isn't just about adults, it's also about children who are not seen as human in the system. So I wonder how you would figure in your model that disabled people could be brought in. Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a couple of points about the relationship between urban and workplace struggles that you talked about. So I think, especially in the recent wake of the Occupy movement, we've seen how inspiring urban struggles can be. But I think it's important not to sort of separate urban struggles from workplace struggles in the sense of raising one above the other in importance. I think that in order to challenge capitalism, you also need to challenge state power, you also need to challenge the economic power of the capitalists. And the point, I think the crucial point of why working class workplace organisation is important is because that's where workers have economic power. So I think we need to talk about a relationship where we're saying that workplace organisation needs to lead those struggles, but obviously urban struggles are really important and need to be linked in together as well. Also, just have a quick point about the state, because I think the point that in order to challenge capitalism, you also need to challenge the capitalist state is something that you raised in rebel cities, and sort of ask a lot of questions about what are the different possibilities for how we're going to do this. Should we organise geographically? Should we have networks? Should we build, like you mentioned, on the trades councils and stuff like that? But I wondered if you could comment a bit more on how you deal with the capitalist state. If you're talking about being revolutionary and talking about an anti-capitalist transformation in society, because I think we need to dismantle the capitalist state, and in order to do that you need kind of centralised organisation, you need very clear strategy and politics, and I think that doesn't quite the idea of a network of socialist cities and of a socialist movement arising out of that doesn't seem to me that it properly deals with the question of the capitalist state.
I'm going to kind of point that sort of supplements and complements David one, and kind of, anyway, let's put it forward. If I came in 10 minutes late, so if it's already been made, can you wince loudly and I'll just shut up? But one kind of point I've noticed about the difference between going into this crisis, from 2008 after, and going into the crisis around 1973, looking sort of comparative crisisology of capitalism, is of course approaching the crisis of the early 70s. The working class was gaining in sectional strength. It was in a way quite depoliticised. In each section of the workplace, there was a whole series of strikes in the 60s that built up the sectional strength of the working class in a section, in a syndicalist way. And then when the crisis hit, they generalised. So we had all the explosions in 72, 73. And isn't it the total opposite with this crisis? It's almost like working class struggle and organisation and confidence was flatlining for nearly 20 years. And then the crisis hits. And in a way, that's why the general political struggle is what mobilises the working class more than the sectional struggle. And that's why, the working class seems to only be able to move as one, like on November the 30th. People only feel confident to move in their millions rather than in their small section. But then, in Lancaster, we had 1,500 people on the strike rally, and then out of that came the occupation of the city square where we were holding the strike rally. And then the Occupy movement drew in loads of unorganised workers, young workers who work in restaurants and McDonald's and all those kind of muck jobs, who don't feel, who are, even less confident than hospital workers or education workers, and the way those things combine. And so it's almost the general political questions, but then there's a dialectic that then, when people experience occupying their city centre, then they go, we were talking to them about what is the possibility of organising in the workplace. So, rather than the city square occupation and the neighbourhood struggle being a substitute then for workplace struggle, is they kind of dialectically interact. And one problem I have with David, it might actually, be true about the class structure today that people are more fragmented. But there was, so I'm just longing for a period of history that's past maybe, but there's something about workers' councils and workers' delegates and factory councils that makes those delegates accountable, because you're working with them the next day. If you don't like their decision, you can change it. But, they make something more nebulous and open to populist forces with the more neighbourhood idea. So, whether there are problems with that as well, but if that's just the state of the class structure and how the class is going to compose itself in the future struggle, we're stuck with that, and we're going to have to work with it.
In representing a forgotten section of our class. If you come to Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire or South Yorkshire, you have an urban working class located in urban settlements that are found in rural areas, and I'm talking about the towns and the villages of former mining areas. Our struggles are as valid as those that take place in cities. We seek to be part of a risen people as well, and it's our determination to bring sections of our class and our community to this city on October the 20th to help build the million-strong TUC demonstration.
Along the lines of the argument of the first comrade who gave us his comment, I would also like to suggest stretching further the concept of the urban proletariat to include people beyond the working class, even the working class understood as broadly as David just suggested earlier. And I would suggest to include people who indeed have the right to the city but are increasingly excluded out of it, but not included in this concept of the working class, such as people being unemployed and for whom it is increasingly difficult to use cities, but who indeed have the right to use it, and but for whom it is increasingly difficult to do it, to use different kind of benefit offices and just to travel without an income. And a second group who I would include in the concept of the urban proletariat, and obviously in the group who would need to revolt and to rebel for the city is the people who are homeless currently and who are targeted by increasingly criminalizing and punitive urban policies. Thanks.
So first of all, thank you, David. I think it's really important what you're doing, like looking at cities which we maybe haven't done enough, and trying to analyze and conceptualize the lessons that we can draw from urban struggle. I would like to briefly look at Cairo, because I think it's a very important and interesting case. I think Cairo illustrates very well that there's actually a very large section also in the global south are living in cities. For example, one fourth, I think, of the Egyptian population lives in Cairo alone. So that's a massive, massive city. And about 70% or 80%, the numbers differ, of the people living there live actually in slums. So the pictures that you've seen from Tahrir Square during the revolution is just a very tiny section of the actual population of Cairo. Like, barely anyone lives actually in that area. Although there is, for example, a neighborhood, Boulak al-Dakour, which is very close to Tahrir Square, and it's a very poor neighborhood. You can see, but at the same time you see, like, in the areas in the periphery around Cairo, I discovered that accidentally, there's a huge housing bubble in the middle of the desert where there's nothing. You can drive for kilometers throughout empty houses, whereas like the huge majority of the city lives in slums. It shows how insane the situation is and how insane capitalism actually is. The lessons that we can draw from Cairo are, I think, very important. Like, for example, people from Boulak have played an important role in the revolution from the poor neighborhoods, fighting against being sent out of the center of the city. And they have organized themselves in many different parts, not just Boulak, but in almost every neighborhood. They have organized themselves in Lega Shabia and popular committees. But these popular committees, they were a key to the revolution, stabilizing the revolution. But they were not just the only force that could have realized the revolution, because their class base was ambiguous. So I think it was central that there was a revolutionary organization that influenced the politics in these committees, and there was a working class that worked together in alliance with these popular committees.
I think that one of the most important things that comes out of David's work and in his discussion earlier on is getting away from a very impoverished idea of what class is, as though to be working class means that you work in a factory. This is certainly not a serious Marxist position. If you think about Geoffrey de Stecquois, the great Marxist historian, he talks about how class is the expression of the fact of exploitation in the social structure. And if you think about that, you can start to see how a limitation of class to simply being, are you working in a factory, is completely nonsensical. If you think about Britain today, for example, think about the amount of labour power, the amount of workers that are employed directly in the reproduction of labour power itself. So people who work in schools, in hospitals. It would be crazy to talk about these people as not being working class. And what this brings us to is, and of course, sorry, the obvious great expression of this was the 30th of November strike of 2.5 million people. This is very, very important because actually at the moment there are certain ideas that try to rule this out. And you have on the one hand, I think, the basically foolish conception of Slavoj Žižek that these people represent essentially a salaried bourgeoisie who are rebelling against becoming part of the proletariat. And the other side that you have of this is something that you've seen expressed in some very ultra-left ways, particularly if you look at some elements of the Occupy movement in Oakland, the way in which the expression of the necessity of protesters from Occupy and whatnot to go and close down factories, to interrupt the flow of profit, whether or not the workers there are involved or not. And I think that David's arguments around class strengthen arguments against that. The one brief thing I wanted to say, though, is I think that when we talk about trade unions, or trade unions fighting for this or that sectional interest. I think we have to be very clear that we can't talk about trade unions as being some kind of homogenous bloc. When we're talking about trade unions, there are divisions between right and left, but also much more fundamentally between bureaucracy and rank and file. And I think that the role of revolutionaries at this moment, of course, we're involved in every urban struggle, and you can think about the way in which the protests of the electricians in London linked up in remarkable ways with both students and the Occupy movement, and eventually won a tremendous victory. But I think that we have to look to the role of revolutionaries within trade unions as well as being part of winning an argument for the left and amongst the rank and file, so that we can move away and transcend any kind of sectional ideas towards a strategy for how we win and a strategy for the 99%.
Yeah, I don't think that David, and I'd like to ask him this, is actually counterposing urban revolt and workplace organisation, but that rather urban revolt can be an expression of how the working class is the level of expression of the working class at that moment. I haven't read Rebel Cities yet, I'm looking forward to reading it, but your work on Paris in 1848, I think shows wonderfully how the barricades, which was a thing that emerged then, express precisely the small workplaces that existed in Paris, very few with more than 100 workers. The fact that they picked up the pavé from the street became an expression of a nascent working class in a wonderful way in the case of Paris, and was expressed differently in other cities depending on the organisation. So therefore the Chartist movement in Britain was very, very different to, even though it was some sort of urban revolt as well. So in the 19th century, I don't think there was an opposition between the state of the class struggle and its expression in urban centres. And today, I think the Occupy movement proves this absolutely wonderfully. And somebody mentioned, are you ignoring the state if you just concentrate on the city? Well, if we take Tahrir Square, it wasn't a sort of symbolic thing. It was an absolute political necessity that square was occupied, because the repression was so great that the only way to come out and oppose the government and the state was to occupy that square. And I think in different places, different occupations have different political motivations. Somebody mentioned the Oakland thing, and again, in Oakland, what was so amazing was not only how the Tahrir Square, from this repressive situation and how it happened, in Oakland was translated to people occupying, probably very mixed, probably some of them with all sorts of different ideas about the working class, but the fact that they could stop the longshoremen with that is a wonderful example of how the two struggles could link up. It wasn't the case everywhere. For example, in Ireland we had a tiny occupation, and I think it reflected the strength of the working class organisation at that time. So I think what David's saying is very, very useful for us, because it actually shows that where we can generalise, we can strengthen our movement, we can make it more political, and we can raise all those general demands that sometimes in the workplace is more difficult to do.
Okay, in South Africa there is currently a rebellion of the poor and also a massive strike movement, and I think I can demonstrate that since about 2005 has been the highest level of both of these forms of action anywhere in the world. But they're going on in parallel, side by side, not at the moment connecting with each other. My suggestion is that what we see are different relationships to the means and ends of protest. For workers, the boss lies in front of the state. For people protesting in the communities, mostly young people, the state exists in front of the boss. And clearly there are different forms of strike action amongst workers, and then amongst youth, particularly in the townships, people effectively engaging in insurrectionary activities, putting up barricades, defending them against the police, blocking off cars from moving along the streets, and then often destroying all the public buildings in their neighbourhood. Now, there are weaknesses in that form of action for people in the communities, because once you've destroyed a neighbourhood, there's not much left you can do, and people are becoming very worried about that in those forms of struggle. Possibly one can argue on the basis of that workers are in a stronger position than people in the communities because of the different forms of action they can engage in, and the possibility for them to create a new society altogether. But what we saw in the 1980s in South Africa was a shift from a divided working class to a division of labour in the struggle, with workers taking strike action alongside people in the communities who were effectively enforcing those strikes, making people engage in further activity in the communities and elsewhere by means of acting effectively as pickets, stopping people from leaving the townships. So there can be a shift then from that division to a division of labour in the struggle, and I don't know what David wants to say in response to that.
Okay, there are a lot of questions here, but let me, Marx once said often the only answer to a question is to question the question. So I want to pose a question, since I don't have an answer to it, and I want to pose it to you. I just arrived here from Greece. I was 3 weeks in Greece, and we geographers have a joke which goes as follows: that if you've been in the country for 3 weeks, you write a book. If you've been there for 3 months, you write an article. If you've been there for 3 years, you write nothing. So I'm unfortunately a huge, instant kind of authority on everything that's happening in Greece. But it was extremely interesting, of course, to be there during the election and watch what was happening. It's clear when you look at the pattern of the vote for Syriza that it was urban and highly concentrated in urban. And when I asked around, it wasn't just people, discontent and wanting to vote for an anti-austerity politics. There was some organisation going on, but Syriza's a very small party. They were so concerned that they might get into government that they realised they wouldn't have enough people to run the government, given the size of the party. And they went from, 4% of the vote 18 months ago to 27% of the vote, coming close. So where was their support coming from, and what was their support about? And to what degree was the support for them organised? Now, they're not an anti-capitalist party, but they got a lot of support from neighbourhood organisations. A lot of support. And different neighbourhood organisations, organisations not only neighbourhood but working on immigrant workers' rights and all those kinds of things. So in a way, their vote came from the social movements, and the big question is what's going to be their relationship as a party, as a political party, to these social movements, and how will it work? Now, there is a little complicated history of this. For example, if you go back to the 1960s and look at the anti-Franco struggles in Spain, a lot of it was orchestrated through the neighbourhood organisations, which are animated by the Communist Party. The neighbourhood organisations were extremely strong, very powerful, very articulate. Of course, since the Communist Party was banned, it was not Communist Party line officially, and so there were a good deal of autonomy. One of the worst things that happened to the neighbourhood organisations was when, Franco's gone and the Communist Party is legalised, and the Communist Party starts to treat the neighbourhood organisation as a mere conduit for its centralised policies. And as a result of that, the neighbourhood organisations lost their vigour, they lost their cohesion, they lost their impact. Now, this means there's a complicated relationship between any political party and neighbourhood organisations, and what that might be about. And I can remember being in Oxford during the poll tax struggle, in which the Socialist Workers' Party played a very important role, a very, very powerful and significant role. But the vigour of the neighbourhood organisation was often cut across by the fact that the Socialist Workers' Party often saw this as a means to recruit and as a means to do all the other things. Which you might think is a great idea. But actually it destroyed the neighbourhood organisations. They disappeared. A lot of them disappeared. Now, this is a complicated kind of problem, okay? And if you don't think it's a complicated problem, then you better think again. because Syriza's going to face this problem right now. And how they do it, I think, is going to be critical, because a new form of politics could emerge out of this. But if a political party attempts to superimpose its views and its will upon these autonomous organizations, and they are autonomous, and in Greece they're very proud of their autonomy, and they are not going to tolerate, if you like, being dictated to. So at the same time, there's got to be a much more dialectical relationship between the autonomy of neighbourhood organisations and their capacity and their vigour and their capacity to innovate on their own and do their own kind of stuff. There's got to be a real lot of thinking about how to relate that vigour to the political party. And we see an example of this in Bolivia, in El Alto, where, you know, the neighbourhood organisations in El Alto are extremely vigorous and extremely autonomous, and to some degree paved the way for Evo Morales coming to power. And now those neighbourhood organisations are in conflict with Morales' party, and in conflict with Morales' government, because the Morales government has taken certain, you know, kind of positions which, you know, you can logically argue are inevitable given it has to, you know, what it has to do. So it's a big question here, and I want to throw it out on the agenda, and I'm probably going to be slaughtered afterwards by, you know, the various, but be careful about this one. You've got to be really careful about this, and you've really got to think carefully about what you're doing, because the politics of this can either explode or they can implode. And this I think is about relationship, how to deal with these particular movements. Now there are a lot of questions. One of which, of course, is the question of, by talking about the urban, and am I excluding rural, and, you know, typical kinds of questions of that sort. This is, you know, in a brief presentation, I couldn't get into the complexity of this. One of the things that struck me about reading Henri Lefebvre's work was he understood that the rural in France was beginning, as an independent, if you like, social formation, was beginning to disappear. It was being absorbed into an urbanisation process in which there was uneven geographical development going on. And yes, indeed, the areas we traditionally refer to as rural, but they're no longer rural in the sense that they're, you know, an independent present society or anything of that kind. You're talking about, you know, a countryside that is absorbed into leisure and second houses and agricultural production and all the rest of it. So in a sense, what we've seen is the urbanisation of the countryside. And Lefebvre saw that happening and said that's going to be a global process. And in much of the world, it has gone to the point where the distinctions are no longer valid in the sense of a distinctive rural society and urban society. But what is valid is, of course, an uneven geographical development within, say, a whole kind of bioregion or metropolitan region or something of that kind, which you have to then to look at as an integral whole. But there is fierce social and political and economic differences within the urban core between, say, the Bronx and Manhattan, as there are between, say, New York City and the rural. In other words, you're looking at an uneven geographical development within the urbanisation process. So if I was having a complicated talk, I would want to talk much more about that. But one of the crucial things is to build alliances across these different arenas of uneven geographical development, and that means that, say, a ward organisation in Brooklyn is going to look very different in terms of what it's about and what it's working towards than, say, a ward organisation in the Bronx. That ward organisations in certain immigrant communities are going to look very different from others. But one of the great things about the kind of immigration thing right now is that almost invariably links exist now down through the chain of migrant movement way back. And you can start actually to organise sometimes across those links, and also you can also start to organise around commodity chains. For instance, there is an attempt in New York City to organise on the food chain into New York City, which goes all the way from the farm right the way through the, right way up, into the supermarkets. And you realise that actually the metabolism of the city depends crucially upon a clear flow of food into the city. And one of the things that happened with El Alto was when they blocked the flow of food into La Paz, that's what brought the government down. And if you can organise along the food chain right the way from beginning to end, then you have, the trouble is that a lot of the people in that food chain are illegal immigrants and the like. So it's a complicated kind of question of how to organise. And I think that actually organising on a ward basis, it seems to me, to have involved in it, that things people are concerned as much about the delivery of services into their ward as they are about conditions of labour. And of course there is typically often a gender difference. I mean, in the book I use the example of the Salt of the Earth movie, which I think is very good on this. So you have to sort of imagine that at the ward level you would be looking at organisations like in New York City. Picture the homeless, which is a very important homeless organisation. Organisations like that, and what their presence is in ward politics, we'll call it that. I'm using Gramsci's terms now, they're not using terms which are used in New York City. But and that includes also, of course, the organisation of unemployed, where the unemployed are living, what the conditions of housing are for the unemployed, what the conditions of affordable housing in various parts of the city, how crazy it is that we have these increasing numbers of homeless people in a city where there's empty condominiums all around the place and empty houses all around the place. The complete irrationality of that. Can there be a movement around that? There are movements beginning to emerge around that. So I think that the politics of this become very, very significant, and associated with that is not simply about, and I'm firmly of the belief that the right to the city is not simply a right to what exists in the city, it's a right to think about changing the city into something radically different. And clearly, that radically different would have to take account of many of the environmental and resource questions which should be raised. The fact that suburbanisation of the United States after 1945 was profligate in relationship to land and profligate in consumption of energy, and has been profligate in relation to resource pressures that it's developed all around the world. Again, the desuburbanisation of the United States is I think, very much on the agenda. It has to be on the agenda. How to do that and what that's involved in, or what kinds of forms of redesign of urbanisation one can think about, is going to involve a lot of work by a lot of people. But it's not unfeasible. I mean, if you urbanise the world one way after 1945, you can re-urbanise it another way from now on. I mean, we're smart enough to be able to do that, and we have the resources, I think, to be able to do that. But it has to be along lines which are far less, the environmental footprint has to be far less, reorganisation of work in relationship to residents, those kinds of things have to be reconfigured as well. So there are lots of things to be done along those lines. Now, I didn't mean to suggest that obviously trade unions are very different. What I've experienced in the United States is that the conventional trade union movement was very hostile to many of these movements. For example, the attempts to organise the excluded workers. The trade union movement in general was hostile. Particular groups within it, locals, were often very, very supportive. The same was true of struggles over living wages and things of that kind. But now, I think the main union movement has recognised that given the dire state it's in, it only has, in the private sector, it only has an 8% density right now of that, then something has to be done. And so they're now prepared to move into an alliance with organisations like the Excluded Workers Congress and offer support rather than to try to detract from what the Excluded Workers Congress was about. And finally, there's a kind of question of the state. I think you have to stop talking about the state as some unified entity. The state is a whole set of different institutions, some of which are, of course, about repression, some of which are about organising, and for instance, what I call the state finance nexus, the Treasury and the Federal Reserve in the United States is a very powerful set of institutions that has to be dealt with a completely different way than some other institutions. And I think that there's no way in which we can do without some organisational form that looks like a state and walks like a state, and we'll have to call it a state whether we like it or not. Otherwise you get into this incoherence which you get in sort of Hart and Egger's Commonwealth, where I think on page 300 they smash the state, and then 4 pages later they actually say the state should provide universal health care and universal income. So you kind of go, well, you just smashed the damn thing, so how can you do that? You know? So I think a more nuanced view of what those aspects of the state that will really have to be dismantled. For instance, Theresa was faced with this. If it came to power, would it actually get rid of the police apparatus that has been doing all the repression against everybody? And this is, I think, a very crucial kind of question. Just finally, one point. One of the most inspiring movements I've come across recently is indeed the Chilean students' movement. And they understand something. They were the students who were out there in 2006 in the high schools that now occupied and engaged in a vast struggle. But they clearly understand that Pinochet is gone, but Pinochetism is still totally intact. And it understands that it wants to roll back Pinochetism. As soon as this country gets round and understands that it's got to roll back, Thatcherism, because Thatcherism is still the core of everything. But in the United States, we realise get rid of Reaganism as a first step towards anti-capitalist politics. That is what's got to happen, and that's got to be the focus. They've got that focus very clearly. You see similar things going on, I think, right now in Montreal. In Cairo, we've seen something, and just one footnote on the Cairo thing. I had an email from somebody today who said, Tahrir Square was terribly important, but the other important thing was the way the neighbourhoods actually trashed the local police stations and took over the local police stations, and that neighbourhood action was absolutely foundational and fundamental to why it was that Tahrir Square could last in the way it did. So there's always symbolic spaces you want to take over, but there's also the nitty-gritty spaces that you need to deal with, and that dialectic in Cairo seems to have been significant. But then I've never been to Cairo, and so I'm talking about things I really don't know.